Few directors are as consistently inspiring and magnetic to listen to as Guillermo del Toro. The writer-director behind The Shape of Water, Hellboy, The Devil's Backbone, or my personal favorite, Pan's Labyrinth, has a nearly encyclopedic knowledge of seemingly every movie to ever exist, and the most deep reverence for storytelling in any form. He is the antithesis to gatekeeping, and instead uses every opportunity he can to spread his love and passion for art. Did you know that Del Toro cites his use of directional sound design as being inspired from his experience playing video games? That's one of my favorite small tidbits from the Pan's Labyrinth audio commentary. Here's a bigger one. This sequence with Ophelia securing a key from a giant frog was originally intended to be on a much larger set. In Del Toro's initial imagining of the scene, he apparently envisioned the frog as being particularly mobile and articulate, leading to a presumably much more fantastical set piece. Those who have seen the movie know that the frog is the opposite of that, and instead just kinda stands in one place and then dies. The short explanation that Del Toro gives is that they had built a massive puppet that turned out to be simply too big to move in the way he intended. Despite that, Del Toro speculates this was for the best, and that the smaller set forced by practicality ended up reinforcing the true importance of this frog's design, which is that he is unnaturally and fantastically large. When I first heard this, I felt it spoke to the inherent malleable beauty of art. Though as much as we'd like it to, stories do not exist in a vacuum. Particularly those made with money on the line are often constrained to specific rules of practical creation. Kevin Smith's Clerks is a black and white film purely because he couldn't afford to buy studio lighting, and yet some critics would argue its black and white nature adds to the film's atmosphere, as if it were collected from footage on a store's security camera. When forced to work within a strict framework, the imagination is taxed to its utmost and will produce its richest ideas. This is a quote by T.S. Eliot that I found extremely relevant to my own artistic career and something I stick to pretty religiously. Often I find that the true beauty behind a piece of art is the circumstances in which it was made. That's why I love audio commentaries. They present a unique chance to look into the minds of the geniuses who created some of your favorite pieces of art, and oftentimes they can give insight into the creative process in a way that you'd have no other access to besides being on set with them at the time. But what if we took that a step further? Audio commentaries are great, but they're often post-mortem. What if we had something that examined the creation of art as it was being created? In my opinion, something like that would be utterly fascinating. And in fact, that is exactly what Bakuman is. Behind the brilliant story of Death Note are two men, Sugumi Oba and Takashi Obata. This tag team created a manga with only 108 chapters that to this day would continue to float at the top of lists as one of the greatest anime or manga ever made. They've inspired countless individuals to dive deep into the world of storytelling, including myself. They and Death Note are truly legendary, and it would be incredible to be a fly on the wall on their artistic process. Luckily for us, they gave us that exact opportunity when they created the manga Bakuman, a story of two young kids with a dream to be the #1 mangaka of Japan, navigating the real-life struggles of creating and publishing art. It is a story about creating manga for Shonen Jump, written by people creating manga for Shonen Jump. It is the pinnacle of unique insight in a way that I think few other media even can be. There's a scene in the later parts of Bakuman where the two main characters sit down with their editor and really analyze why their manga is failing compared to their genius rival. The beauty of Bakuman is that the lens with which it self-analyzes is one that can really only be learned through experience. In other words, there are things about storytelling that I think you can only realize after you've really written a story. In Bakuman, the two-man team is made up of a writer and an artist. The way these two work from the start is that the writer comes up with a concept, sketches it out in what we would call thumbnails, and then hands it off to the artist to convert into more polished drawings. A helpful way of thinking about this would be like One Punch Man. One Punch Man's webcomic is messy. In its earliest stages, it looks like an MS Paint drawing done with a mouse. At some point in the process, that then gets handed to fellow mangaka Yusuke Murata, who redraws it in his style that we all know and love. This is not identical to the process in Bakuman, but it is pretty similar. For my first comic, I didn't draw thumbnails, but I did write a standard comic book script which heavily detailed how I envisioned the panel composition and the framing of the camera in each individual panel. Unlike myself and the main characters of Bakuman, the rival in the story, Nizuma Eiji, at one point had a unique process in which he was working with a standard novel formatted story with which he adapted freely in whatever panel composition he felt best. In essence, Nizuma had total control of the visual language of the story. What they theorize in this Bakuman scene is that the end result of the main character's process led to a less visually expressive and imaginative presentation. The writer's idea for paneling was basic and lacked any sort of experimentation or finesse, which makes total sense considering that has nothing to do with their job experience. What they propose is the story would actually be better if we skipped over that thumbnailing process entirely, and instead of relying on the writer to dictate the visual direction of the scene, the much more qualified artist would instead have free reign on composition, directly inspired by their rival. In my experience, this is entirely true. I remember having a conversation with my artist after finishing my first comic, in which they basically requested that I stopped giving them scripts like this. They showed me a collage of incredible comic and manga pages with paneling that I could never even conceive of. My focus as a writer was entirely on story structure, character, dialogue, etc. But as an artist, they were so much more equipped to visualize how this information can be delivered with framing and shot composition. It's two entirely different skills. From that point on, all of my comic scripts have been written in a screenplay format. This does mean that any artist I work with needs to have a strong eye for direction, and it also generally implies more work on their part. This is not universally desirable for every situation. I would not recommend this process for someone completely new working with a total stranger due to the aforementioned workload. But I do think there is merit to the idea that this yields a more artistically daring end product. Before I had written my first comic, this was not something I had ever even considered, but this is the type of unique insight that can be presented in a work like Bakuman. What I particularly love about this scene though is the story behind it. I love this meta look at the nature of artistic development. This isn't just a random realization the pair have, but rather is specifically brought on by the circumstances of their life and competition. In fact, this might be one of my favorite aspects of Bakuman. From the very beginning, this story is specifically framed as not just creating art, but creating art within the meta context of Shonen Jump. This is inherently interesting because if you read Bakuman, you're likely already a fan of Shonen Jump, but beyond that, I think it circles back to the idea that art is not created in a vacuum. Our two main characters, Ashirogi Muto, aren't just trying to create the best manga they could think of. They're consistently analyzing the playing field. What is their target audience? What milestone do they need to hit to succeed? How can they subvert the expectations of their readers? Every manga they create is first met with these questions. It's not just, is this story good? It's, will this story work in our current circumstances? If Ashirogi Muto weren't striving to publish in Shonen Jump, or if they were facing different rivals, the stories they created would have been way different. When I wrote my comic Embers, it was specifically as an entry into the Webtoon short story contest. This created some interesting limitations. The story had to either be mind-bending or heartwarming. It had to be 3 to 5 chapters, and it had to be done on a very tight deadline. What many people probably don't know is that the comic I wrote is not the same comic as the one that my artist and I ended up producing. I was incredibly proud of the first story I wrote, and for a long time things were on track and proceeding exactly as planned. The character designs were wonderful, the backgrounds were so detailed and beautiful, and the artist was constantly blowing my mind with their ideas for panel composition. But as the deadline quickly approached, it became clear to us that due to the length of the story I wrote, the comic, while fitting the contest's technical limitations, could not be made by the end of the submission period. This was difficult. We had a couple chapters already completed, I think maybe even 1 or 2 fully released, and suddenly I needed to completely rework the ending. But this was the definition of a strict framework, and while I think it would be presumptuous to say I wrote something rich or imaginative like T.S. Eliot would hope, I was able to write multiple, full new endings over the course of a single night, which the artist and I narrowed down to 1, and, well, ended up making into the comic we submitted. We didn't end up winning, but I do find myself incredibly proud of the comic we created. It was received well by everyone who read it, people praised how touching they thought it was, and some of the story changes led to breathtaking panels that would have never gotten drawn in my original version. I never really talked about this aspect of the story. Most people who have read Embers have no idea this happened, and yet it is easily the most important takeaway I had from the comic's entire existence. You could say the story behind Embers is as important to me as Embers itself. I think this is one of the things that Bakuman has the distinct opportunity to teach. We all like Death Note. I mean, especially if you're a fan of this channel, then you probably fucking love Death Note. But one of the most fascinating things about Death Note is the fact that while some people want to classify it as a seinen story, the reality is that it was published in Shonen Jump. Despite being so far from a battle shonen, it is in fact a battle shonen in so many ways, or as Ashirogi Muto would call it, unorthodox standard battle manga. The overarching conflict of Bakuman across all 176 chapters is a struggle to find the perfect blend between a story that our two main characters are suited to creating, and one that could still be popular among a Shonen Jump audience. This starts with the creation of a one-shot called The Two Earths. The Two Earths is a story about simulated reality and a war being waged between the created Earth, otherwise known as the clones, and the original Earth. The impression we're given is that it's a fairly cerebral manga. While there is a war, the major conflict is one about the nature of existence. It's the type of story where a major climactic beat would be the decision to kill your own clone. In the world of the big three, Naruto, Bleach, and One Piece, The Two Earths feels really out of touch with what a Shonen Jump audience might want. And yet, by nature of it being Ashirogi Muto's first manga, it's clear that this is the type of manga that they have a natural inclination to create. It's obviously not a coincidence that this seems to be the type of story Oba and Obata are drawn to as well. 8 years after the release of Death Note, Obata would go on to work on a manga adaptation of acclaimed sci-fi mindfuck All You Need Is Kill. And the two would reunite again after Bakuman to work on the manga Platinum End, which, while I haven't read it, seems to continue the trend of dark and intellectual. The journey that Ashirogi Muto go on is dallying a little bit deeper in the pool of cerebral storytelling, and then taking a hard shift into classic battle manga with their one-shot My Angel. We don't spend too much time on My Angel, but the basic synopsis we're given is that it's a story about a good angel fighting bad angels in what seems to be a very classically shonen dynamic. It didn't work. These two simply aren't suited to this type of storytelling. There are a lot of manga that get made over the course of Bakuman, but the general structure of the series is one of trying to find balance within genre and tone. It's in creating one of their most interesting stories, Perfect Crime Party, that they develop what they call the unorthodox standard battle manga. In breaking that word salad up, they define it as having standard battle manga characters and placing them in unorthodox plotlines. Perfect Crime Party, or PCP for short, is the story of 3 elementary school geniuses who use their intellect to commit unsolvable, petty crimes. For example, stealing a fellow student's pencil box and replacing it with an exact replica that they would never be able to distinguish. PCP takes the popular shonen elements of a trio of friends, all on the younger side, working as rivals against each other, and the occasional villain. Obviously, we don't know enough about the story to analyze its themes, but at a surface glance, these do seem like character archetypes that could fit in a standard battle shonen. In this case, the unorthodox story would be in replacing typical battles one might get from, say, Soul Eater, My Hero Academia, or Yu Yu Hakusho, and instead replacing them with small bouts of intellectual skirmishes. Instead of developing new abilities, they solve more and more elaborate crimes. At this point in the story, PCP is by far the most successful manga that Ashirogi Muto have developed. It easily lets our main duo flex their intellectual writing tendencies while still keeping it suited to a Shonen Jump demographic. But the follow-up to PCP is probably the one most Death Note fans would be interested in, a manga by the name of Reversi. Reversi is the story of a high school boy who gains the powers of a demon, allowing him to transplant his own thoughts and ideas into the minds of those he touches. He uses his power to start a global movement towards a world that he feels is more just. The story's conflict comes from the appearance of a fellow demon who opposes him by returning the main character's victims back to normal. The manga's evolution into an ideological battle and its cat-and-mouse rivalry paints clear parallels to the real manga of Death Note. While this is far from the standard battle manga of Naruto, One Piece, or Bleach, much like Death Note, the young demographic of Shonen Jump could still find archetypical appeal in high school characters, a protagonist fueled with idealistic ambition, and a classic hero-villain rivalry. And much like Death Note, Reversi would go on to become Ashirogi Muto's magnum opus as a manga that enraptured a massive audience with a clash of intellect unorthodox to the rest of Shonen Jump's lineup. The success of Reversi and its eventual anime adaptation marked the end of Bakuman. In some regard, you could view this entire series as an autobiography depicting the long process of creating Death Note, the trials and tribulations of writing a landmark manga that would distinguish itself as a unique titan in the Shonen Jump Hall of Fame. While it's not really all that accurate, and Oba and Obata don't actually seem to parallel our main duo as much as people would like to think, there is clearly enough integral DNA between the two to be of note. The fact that these people made this story and the ways that they can be linked are far from coincidence. It is through experience as mangaka that they are able to infuse so much potent insight into the narrative. While Bakuman never reached the highest popularity ceilings that Death Note did, it was a successful enough manga to be published for nearly 200 chapters and get adapted into a 3-season anime. But more importantly, I think among the creatives that I speak to, Bakuman holds a distinctly high place as a massively inspirational piece of work. Its depiction of the artistic process and the struggles that go along with it has served as stirring motivation to countless artists, including myself. I think, in a way, while not the only one of its kind, Bakuman is a series that showcases how the story behind a story can often be as dramatic and impactful. Manga like this redefine the way we think about art, not just as an end product existing in complete isolation, but as culminations of artists' near infinite thoughts and efforts. A meta experience that reflects the unique journey of imaginative minds. Normally this is where I would end the video, but I do want to use this opportunity to attest to Bakuman's specific inspiration on my life. While I can't claim to be as experienced or intelligent as the creators of Death Note just yet, I am currently releasing a weekly webtoon that in many ways is a reflection of my experience as a creative here on YouTube, as well as my limited time writing comics for the past 2 years or so. It's the story of 3 young artists trying to survive in the chaotic world of entertainment, and like Bakuman, it's pretty heavily laced with romance as well. So if any of that sounds interesting, you could check it out in the description below. Thank you for watching. I just want to give a quick shout out to all of the incredible patrons over at patreon.com/KatoIT. We're super active in our patron Discord server, occasionally throwing some late night anime and movie watch parties, so if that's something you're interested in, pledge just a single $1 to get an invite. You could also follow us on Twitter at KatoBeyond or read my comics. Links to everything will be in the description.